I first got Death Stranding on my PS4 in 2019. I played it for 2 hours and then stopped. I then left it until November 2022 when I bought the director's cut on my PC. This time around, I played for around 6 hours, reaching the start of Chapter 3, then stopped again. I then picked it up for a third and final time last month in January 2024, and went from Chapter 3 all the way to Chapter 14 in the space of a month. I tend to make a pattern out of this approach to games. Two big examples of this are The Witcher 3 and Elden Ring, dropping both numerous times before one day something just clicks and it becomes my next fixation. With all this in mind, much like those prior examples, I'm relatively annoyed with myself that I failed to give Death Stranding the proper attention it deserved when I first got it, as it quickly became one of my favourite games I've played so far. From its beautiful environments, its themes, its characters, and its raw and unflinching look at the working conditions of the Amazon delivery driver. Now, before I do anything else, I'm going to do a quick overview of the world of Death Stranding, because none of this review will make sense if you skip this section. So, strap in. You are Sam Porter Bridges, a courier who is quickly thrust into the grand plan of the United Cities of America to reconnect and rebuild the nation through a system called the Chiral Network, which is essentially free Wi-Fi that allows access to 3D printers that can print various vehicles, weapons, and equipment. To reconnect everyone, you will travel from the east to the west coast of America, delivering needed packages to prospective citizens of the UCA and switching them on to the Chiral Network. Sam will encounter various hazards ranging from environmental to NPCs. An environmental one being time falls, which is rain that accelerates the progress of time within nearly all it comes into contact with. The NPCs will take the form of the mules and the BTs. The mules are essentially crackheads who are addicted to packages and will try to steal yours whenever you enter their territory. And the most threatening hazard you'll also encounter is that of the beached things, or the BTs for short. These are entities whose souls are stuck in the world of the living following the cataclysmic event known as the Death Stranding. If a BT consumes a living being, it will create a void out, a huge explosion capable of leveling cities with ease. Oh, and you also have a baby in a jar strapped to your suit, and this helps you track those BTs. Now that I've covered the basics, let's talk about the gameplay. The gameplay loop on a micro level is you pick up the packages for delivery, you watch out for these hazards and bad guys, deliver the packages, repeat. Now, on the surface, this appears to be a remarkably repetitive loop, but allow me to counter that by saying this. Death Stranding has one of the most addictive gameplay loops of any game I have ever played. It has taken a fairly niche mechanic and fleshed it out into a game-defining feature in a way that isn't often seen from AAA titles. The game is designed entirely on player exploration and choice, allowing the player to take whichever avenue they choose to get their packages delivered, whether that be a short but narrow canyon full of BTs, or a safer, longer path in the mountains that could eventually become treacherous and cause damage to packages if the player doesn't come properly equipped. The possibilities for how you could go about a task are endless, and this is furthered by the game's community-driven multiplayer aspects. The multiplayer takes cues from Souls-likes, where players can leave each other messages that provide useful and insightful information. But instead of just messages, it takes the form of items donated to shared lockers that anyone can pick up, icons placed in the world that act as hints and warnings to other players, and the biggest element is the structures built by other players in their own playthroughs brought into yours to help and support you along your journey. These structures can sometimes be genuine lifesavers for your run, such as a ladder bridge across steep lakes, ropes for climbing up and down a steep cliff face, generators that can recharge your electronics, and in some cases, full-on roads that make traversal an absolute breeze. You will never ever meet another player, but these elements really helped build that sense of community, and it was actually so good and almost heartwarming to see that people are still looking out for each other in this game after all these years. The part that absolutely captured me were these rare moments of absolute serenity I had when I was taking these packages to their destinations. When the BTs and the mules are absent, and you just stop for a second and take in the vast, desolate landscapes that stretch on for miles, Death Stranding quickly becomes one of the most visually stunning, relaxing, and therapeutic games you could ever play. The gameplay is slow burn, no doubt about it. I remember seeing upon release, everyone kept saying that it picks up after Chapter 3 and that you've just got to stick with it. And there is some truth to that. But here's the thing. When this moment did occur, I almost didn't want it to. What I mean by this is that Death Stranding can go from 0 to 100 at the drop of a medium-sized package. For example, by the time of Chapter 3, I am fully into the groove of the game. I'm delivering packages, evading BTs and mules with ease, exceeding customer expectations, rebuilding America. And then, out of the blue, I'm given a last-minute package to deliver. And I'm like, oh, what could it be? Yeah, it's a small handheld thermonuclear device, ready to blow if I mishandle it. Yeah, that was a shock. And I'm kind of just sat there like, oh man, these stakes are way too high. I just delivered a mail. I'm just a mailman. I'm just a silly little guy. This is too much for me. For me, it was almost comedic the way the game at this point just kind of snaps you back into the plot and it says, yup, don't forget, you're the main character and there's stakes and risk. Along with this snap back into the story of Death Stranding, it also dives into an area that hasn't really been touched so far, and that's Death Stranding's combat elements. The combat feels fine, but it also feels like it was shoved in as a bit of an afterthought, so it wasn't a total departure from prior Kojima titles. The shooting and the combat mechanics themselves, again, are fine. They are certainly not the most enjoyable part of the game. They feel very standard to a third-person shooter, and unfortunately, the boss fights you primarily use them in feel very run-of-the-mill too. The boss fights throughout most of the game, save the Higgs boss fight near the end, can be boiled down to shoot at the giant oozy creature until it dies. And with these boss fights, there's some platforming elements involved, as the BTs change the landscapes around you into a lake of black sludge, with cars and buildings rising from its depths. Whilst these elements can initially be challenging on the first try, this formula eventually becomes repetitive enough that you know exactly what to do on the next one. The reward for doing these BT boss fights is always an abundance of chiral crystals, which is a bit of a naff reward given that however you decide to play this game, that is a resource you will basically never run short of. Even when you're actively avoiding BT fights like I did, you can find chiral crystals everywhere in the world of Death Stranding. With this in mind, when you're in a boss fight, you're not thinking about the reward anymore. You already know what it is. Rather, you're thinking that this fight is simply a barrier to story progression, and you'll come to find them very tedious. Now, with boss fights, it does change it up a little bit with battlefield chapters, which are basically chapters where you are sucked into another dimension that takes the form of these impressive war-torn backdrops to fight a guy named Cliff. These are all excellent and very cinematic areas that, unfortunately, set the stage for remarkably repetitive shooter gameplay, which just boils down to shooting Cliff a set amount of times until the next cutscene. Death Stranding mostly gives you weapons for the sake of these boss fights and these battlefield chapters. Anything outside of these, you are actively discouraged from deploying lethal force, which, in my opinion, is absolutely fine, as there is a plot element to it, with people's deaths causing massive explosions, and that it kind of flies in the face of the whole message of togetherness the game tries to convey if you can simply kill everyone that hinders you. Then again, you can essentially avoid most combat aspects of Death Stranding that are not integral to its plot by using stealth, which is more or less essential in the opening chapters of the game, as you do not stand a chance against the BTs and the mules due to a complete lack of offensive weapons. In the end, I was glad it was not encouraged, as it would have become all around boring, as the most fun aspects of Death Stranding come from what it tries to do differently. But in the later half of the game, it moves further towards this action-style gameplay, which for me was a shame, as I found myself almost missing what the game was between chapters 1 and 6. Now, let's chat about the plot of Death Stranding to the best of my ability. Right out the gate, Death Stranding throws so much exposition and information at you that you absolutely have to lock in and pay attention through long cutscenes and dozens of emails. These emails are basically the equivalent of the Metal Gear Solid 5 audio tapes, but in text form, which I wouldn't exactly call an improvement. I think if you played prior Hideo Kojima games and enjoyed his writing, you'll love it in this one. It is untethered, no limits Kojima, which can be a very interesting experience to say the least. Remember in my Metal Gear Solid 5 review, where I said that Kojima can get away with murder sometimes? Yeah, this game is what I meant by that. This game has a way of selling the narrative to you that, on the surface, shouldn't be this compelling, but you can't help but just go along with it, almost hypnotically brushing off the weirdest moments with relative ease and just running with it. Babies in jars help locate ghosts? Sure, why not? This guy's name is Die Hardman? Alright, yeah, that's pretty cool. Del Toro wants to take a shower with me? Hell yeah. The fate of the human race will be determined by a straight-up fist fight? Well, there's an out new there, to be fair. Let's do it, let's go. When it comes to the overall narrative itself, it's not necessarily difficult to follow along to, but I noticed across the whole story it kept having these moments where you'll sit there like, ah yes, I understand. And then it does its best to convince you that you don't, by throwing more exposition and jargon at you until it all becomes too much, and then it starts to sound like the kind of waffle that would be rattled off in an episode of Doctor Who. Also, this story has twists. So many I almost lost track. Some I found to be fairly obvious, especially when it came to the twist surrounding Amelie, who spent the majority of the game acting suspicious on a beach. But others, like Cliff being Sam's father, and the visions we had been having across the entire game, weren't our BB's, but ours. I'll admit, I never saw it coming until right at the very end, and it was incredibly well acted by both Norman Reedus and Mads Mikkelsen. With that being said, whilst the history and the lore of the world of Death Stranding can sometimes be remarkably dense, its characters are written well enough to keep you invested throughout. Each side character has depth and substance, covered in their own individual chapters as you learn more about them and what brought them to where they are now. A favourite of mine is Hartman, a man who goes into cardiac arrest for 3 minutes every 21 minutes so he can go onto the beach to search for his wife and child. Put simply, the story is fully carried by these compelling characters, such as Fragile, Die Hardman, Deadman, and Cliff, all brought to life by some absolutely spectacular performances by their real-life counterparts. Even with its flaws, I still very much enjoyed the story of Death Stranding, and its sequel, which I've seen the trailer for and determined that it looks awesome, will be a day one purchase for me. The story is a strange, dreamlike narrative that you can't help but get lost in. It is bleak, it is hopeful, it is beautiful, and so compelling to the point that I truly did not want it to end. To conclude, Death Stranding is a good game. I feel like time has been very kind to it. From a very divisive launch, which was pretty much split down the middle about who would like it and who didn't. It was essentially Marmite. You either loved it or you hated it. I feel that if people just gave it a chance, they'd find that they'd enjoy it. If you didn't, I fully understand that. This game is not everyone's cup of tea. That is more than fair. And this leads me on to the last thing I'll say on Death Stranding. In hindsight, I feel that if this game had been released a few months later, its overall themes and messages would have resonated with people a lot more. In a period where maintaining connections became much more difficult, the sense of community as most people knew it ceased to exist, and then people having to adapt to that new normal, I had this thought continuously as I played that maybe the reception to this game wouldn't have been as divisive as it was had it been released during lockdown. And on that point, that is the end of my review of Death Stranding. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you did enjoy it. If you did, I have a bunch of other reviews before this one. They're all in the playlist, which should be on the screen somewhere now. Thank you all very much for watching. I shall see you in the next one. Bye now.